Today we're going to be learning Masechet Sukkah Daf Yud. This is the daf for Shabbat. Tomorrow, after Shabbat, is Tisha B'Av. There's a customary not to learn Torah on Tisha B'Av. Some people have the custom that they do learn in the afternoon, after midday. So everyone according to their custom. I will try to put up the daf earlier so that if people want to learn it earlier, they can. If not, you can learn it after Tisha B'Av or again according to your custom. With that, we will get started on our daf. We ended with Rabbi Yirmiyah, who gave 4 cases that you can have a sukkah on top of a sukkah. Sometimes both are kasher, sometimes both are pasul, no good. Sometimes one is kasher and the other isn't, either the top one yes and the bottom one not, or the reverse. So let's just go to the beginning of our daf, or right at the very bottom of the previous daf, and go over the last 2 cases. Sometimes the lower one is good, but the bottom one is not good. What could be the case? The bottom one has perfectly good schach, that's more shade than sun, but the top one has more sun than shade. And the Gemara adds, and this I just want to point out, is only according to some versions of the text. Other people have a different version. Rashi goes with this one. And they say that both are within 20. Now, if both are within 20, what happens? If the top one is more sun than shade, then it's basically not counted as anything, in which case you just ignore it. The bottom one is totally fine. The top one obviously can't be a sukkah. But Rabbeinu Tam, and if you look back on Tet Amud Bet, there's a very, very long Tosfot. And in there, Rabbeinu Tam basically says that's not the case. Rabbeinu Tam says no. And let's talk about Rashi for a minute. If according to Rashi, what would happen if it was above 20? Why would that, and it's Rashi takes our version of the text and says, it says as long as they're both within 20. If the upper one is above 20, what's the problem? Now, when we say in all these cases of above 20, below 20, we mean that the top sukkah is less than 20 or more than 20 above the bottom sukkah, not from the floor, but from the bottom, from the floor of that sukkah, which is on top of the other sukkah. Now, if it's 20 above the bottom sukkah, then what happens? Well, now we have a disqualified sukkah, in which case Rashi says, well, then the schach is considered disqualified schach. If the schach is disqualified, then what do we have? We have a situation where we have disqualified schach on the top sukkah. On the bottom sukkah, we have perfectly good schach, but it's under disqualified schach. If that schach is disqualified, then it's going to basically ruin your bottom sukkah, because your bottom sukkah is now under disqualified schach. If they're both within 20 and it's just that it's more sun than shade, that's not called disqualified. That's just not enough schach. In which case we basically look at it as if the bottom schach is your good schach. You have some more on top of it, but it doesn't ruin your sukkah. What's interesting according to Rashi, and in a minute I'll get to Rabbeinu Tam, Rashi views schach at a height of above 20 cubits as disqualified schach. Rabbeinu Tam says, no, that's not disqualified. That's a problem, not of the schach, it's a problem of the height of the sukkah. There's 2 different things. There's disqualified schach for all sorts of reasons, which we'll get into as we go on. Schach can be disqualified. But if the schach is too high, that's a problem with your sukkah, not with your schach. So therefore, Rabbeinu Tam says instead of his version is instead of B'kaimen Travayu B'toch Esrim, they're both within 20. Rabbeinu Tam's version is that even if they're above, even if the upper one is above 20, even if it's above 20, it still doesn't make it disqualified schach. Okay, the continuation of the Gemara, we're going to read according to Rashi's reading. Okay, it'll have to be read a little differently according to Tosfot, but I just wanted to bring up Tosfot to make you understand that there was this difference. What I found interesting was this difference between is a height of above 20, do we call the schach disqualified schach or not? Okay, that's an interesting question. Or do we look at it as height problem, but not schach problem? Whereas Rashi views it all as one thing. Because the schach is too high, that's considered disqualified schach. Okay, back to the last case. So what would that be? The top one is good, but the bottom one is problematic. Both have perfectly good schach, but the top one is within 20. That means the top one is totally fine because it's within 20 of the bottom. So you have less than 20 of height. It's perfectly good sukkah. The bottom one is called a sukkah within a sukkah, right? A sukkah with a sukkah on top of it. And it's no good because it has this sukkah on top of it. And you can't have a sukkah on top of a sukkah. So now the Gemara says, Pshita. This whole thing is pretty obvious. What is Rabbi Yirmiyah trying to tell us? So they say specifically on that case that I started with today, where Rashi and Tosfot disagree, specifically that case was the one that wasn't obvious. And as I told you before, I'm only going to explain this according to Rashi. The bottom one is good. The bottom one is good, but the top one is disqualified. That one was necessary to teach why. You might have said, you might have thought that maybe we should make a gzerakan. Why? If, again, assuming Rashi, it's within 20 of the other one. If it's within 20, then we're going to say the top one is no good because it doesn't have proper schach, because it's not shady enough. The bottom one, it's as if it just has perfect schach, and it's as if the top one is really not a sukkah at all. It's nothing. Now, you might have thought that it's forbidden. For what reason would it be forbidden? You might have thought that if we allow this, what if it's above 20? When it's within 20, it's totally fine. And the bottom will be fine. Obviously, the top one isn't a sukkah at all because it doesn't have proper schach. But if we allow the bottom one in this case, you might have thought in a case where the top sukkah was above 20, in which case we have disqualified schach, again, according to Rashi's reading. If it's disqualified schach, then the bottom sukkah now has above it good schach, its own schach, and above it, from the top sukkah, it has disqualified schach. And then we mix the two, and they're not nullified because remember, we learned yesterday, they're not together. Only if they're together are they nullified. They're not together. One is on top of the other. In that case, the disqualified schach is going to ruin the bottom schach. Since that's the case, if it were above 20, that would be the case, and the bottom sukkah would actually be disqualified. Maybe we shouldn't even permit it when there's less than 20 and it's okay. Maybe we should make an ordinance and say, well, we're going to forbid this one so that you don't come to think the other one is permitted. Kamash mala, that's why Rabbi Yomi came to tell us, no, we're not worried about that, and it's okay. Since we have the sukkah on top of a sukkah, at what point do we call the top part a sukkah? How high does it need to be? Now, the obvious would be to say 10 tefachim, because that's your minimum sukkah. But interestingly enough, not everybody agrees with this. And this is another example where they borrow terminology used in other cases or measurements used in other situations. So we're going to see three answers. The first one, Amar Rav Huna, tefach. It's all it needs to be the top sukkah to call this a sukkah on top of a sukkah, right? Assuming it's all kosher schach, right? We have the bottom sukkah, we have the roof, the schach of the bottom sukkah is the floor of the upper sukkah. Then we have a tefach of space, and then we have again schach. That's going to be called a sukkah on top of a sukkah, or a sukkah underneath a sukkah. How does he get to a tefach? When it comes to Tuma, impurity in a tent, we say it's a tefach. How do we know this? We've learned this before. Ditnan, tefach al tefach berum tefach, 1 by 1 length and width, with a height of 1 tefach. That gives something the law of oil. We talked about this just a few days ago. If I have part of a dead body, and on top of that, there's airspace of a tefach, and you also need, it seems, width and length of a tefach, and above that is a roof, then anything within that tefach space, or if it's bigger than that, is all going to be, everything under that roof is going to be impure. But the Tuma is not going to go all the way straight up through the roof. The roof is going to block the Tuma from going out. And that's what it means. Chotzetz b'fnei Tuma. Mevi'at Tuma means everything inside will be a problem. And chotzetz meaning, but then it stops. It's only things inside this tent. Aval pachot mirum tefach. But if it's less than the height of a tefach, lo mevi v'lo chotzetz. Then not everything in this tent is going to be, and the roof is not going to block. What's going to happen? Wherever the dead body is, all the Tuma, anything is going to go, all the impurity will go straight up above the dead body and through the roof, basically, but not to the sides. So there you see, tefach is the height. We're going to use that also in sukkah, because a sukkah is a type of tent, basically, right? It makes sense. Next opinion. Rav Chisda v'Rav Abba, Rav Huna Amrei Arba'ah. They say 4 tvachim. Why 4? We never find an important space less than 4 tvachim. What are we discussing? Well, usually this is in Shabbat. We learned about Rishuyot. Remember Rishut Rabim, what's Rishut Yachid? A private domain within, let's say, a public space. We have a little structure. it will be called a private domain if it's 10 tefachim of height and 4 by 4 width, 4 handbreadths. So now, what do we have? Well, 4 is irrelevant. It means it's a certain, we saw it with Mavoy also. Things are 4, we just saw it the other day, 4 away from the wall, right? Within less than 4, we'll call that dofen akuma. So we have this idea of 4 tefachim being a significant measurement. What's interesting is almost always when 4 tefachim are mentioned, it's not height, it's length or width. But in this case, we're going to apply it also to height. And therefore he says 4 tefachim. Third opinion, Shmor amar asara. This is a much more obvious one, as we said before, my time at the Shmor. The way it becomes permitted is the same way it was disqualified. Meaning, just like a sukkah, in order to be kosher sukkah, needs 10. So also for it to disqualify and for it to be called a sukkah in a sukkah, it's going to have to be 10 of height. Now we're going to bring up a question on Shmor. Tanan, it says in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, ein julim ba'elyona tachtona kshera. If nobody's living in the upper sukkah, then the bottom one is okay. Now, my ein diurim, what does it mean if nobody's living there? How do we understand it? And we talked about this when we read the Mishnah. If you mean actually people living there, atu diurim kagarme? What, does it really make a difference whether people are living there or not? That's what's going to disqualify the bottom one. Shouldn't it be if it could be lived in, right? What's the difference whether if nobody's living there, why should that make a difference? Still, someone could potentially live there. Elalav my ein diurim kol she'ena ruya ledira. It must be if it can't be lived in. Well, hechidami, what would that be? It can't be lived in. It must mean it's not 10 tefachim tall, right? Even 10 tefachim is very short for living in, but presumably you could live there as long as you didn't really stand up all the way, but you could live, lying down, sitting, kind of that. You could use it as living space. But if it's not 10 high, then you can't. And that must be what Rabbi Yehuda is saying. Why is that a problem? That sounds exactly like Shmor. But Rabbi Yehuda is disagreeing with Tanakama. So now, Michlal, if that's what Rabbi Yehuda says you need 10, Michlal de Tanakama Savar, Afal Pi She'ena Ruya Ledira Psula, it must be the rabbis or the unnamed opinion that disagree with Rabbi Yehuda must be saying even less than that will disqualify your sukkah, which sounds like less than 10 tefachim. So how can we explain this? Ki'ata Rav Dimi, when Rav Dimi came from Israel to Bavel and started in Babylonia and started explaining things that they learned from there, he said, Amrei b'ma'arava, in Israel they taught, Im ena tachtona yichola lekabel karim u'kisatot shel elyona, hatachtona kshera. It's not talking about the height. It's talking about could you live in there, meaning is the floor a good floor? Think about it. Your floor is made of schach in the top sukkah. Now, schach could be made from palm fronds. You can't really live on those. But if you have something much stronger, you could actually live there. So now the question is, how strong does it need to be? According to Rabbi Yehuda, if it can't hold pillows and blankets, then it's not, then the bottom one is actually fine because the top one is really nothing, right? We look at that schach we look at it as 2 sukkahs, but it's not really 2 sukkahs because you can't even put blankets and pillows on the floor of the first one, the top one, then of course it's not really a sukkah, and then it won't disqualify the bottom. Michlal, so from here you can infer, what's Tanakama then? Wait a minute. If he thinks it has to at least hold pillows and blankets, what does Tanakama think then? Tanakama is being more lenient. Tanakama is going to, more stringent, sorry. Tanakama is going to say, even if it can't hold pillows and blankets, you're going to disqualify it? How could that possibly be? How could it be called a sukkah if it can't even hold pillows and blankets? So there's 2 ways it can hold pillows and blankets. Either it can hold pillows and blankets comfortably, or it can sort of hold pillows and blankets. So according to the rabbis, if it could sort of hold pillows and blankets, it already disqualifies. According to Rabbi Yehuda, it really needs to hold pillows and blankets. And that's the difference between them, and in which case we resolved our question against Shmor. New Mishnah. Peres ala sadim mipnei hachama, o tachtem mipnei haneshar, or hanesher. There's different ways to, different people write different pronunciations here, but let's talk about the case. You put a sheet on top. This would be very common in Israel where it's very hot, or maybe other places where it rains, and you want to protect, here they say they're talking about the sun, you want to protect the sunlight from coming into your sukkah. My sukkah lunchtime is very, very hot because of the sun. So you want to put a sheet on top of the schach. Or tachteh, or you want to put under the schach because of the nishar, all the leaves that are falling down. or you had a canopy bed in your sukkah and you put a cover over it. When I was a kid, I had a canopy bed. We actually never put sheets over it. But theoretically, if I had a canopy bed and it was in my sukkah and I put a sheet, I draped a sheet over it, I'd basically that's kind of like a sukkah in a sukkah. All these cases, I'm going to have something that can't be used as schach. We're going to learn later that if it's something that accepts tuma, can be susceptible to impurity, like a piece of cloth, a baguette is always something, a cloth could be susceptible to impurity. You can't use that as schach. So now I've put something that's disqualified for schach as if it's my cover, right? Either on the schach, under the schach, on top of my bed. I can't sleep in that bed if I have a canopy over it with a sheet because I'm basically sleeping under the sheet and not under the schach. Ava, what can I do? You can see the pictures you can find them on our site. They come from the portal Daf Yomi, which is from the Moorot Daf Yomi version of the Gemara. If you have that, you can also order Gemaras with pictures in the back. Either way, you can also find them by clicking on the button on the Hadran site, or in the details of the podcast. It's also there. What does this mean? Instead of a canopy bed with 4 beams in all 4 corners, if you take the part behind, like the bedboard behind my bed, in the middle, you have a pole going up, and by my feet, there's a pole going up in the middle, and you have a pole that connects those 2 poles, and it basically creates this canopy that's an upside down V-shaped canopy, in which case it has no real roof. Then I can have a cover. What would be the most obvious? Like a mosquito net. I could do that. Okay, that can work. That won't ruin my schach. So the Gemara starts off with Rav Chisda. Amar Rav Chisda, lo shanu ela mipnei hanishal, aval lenaota kshera. This is only, it says, if I put the sheet under the schach because of the leaves that are falling, the schach that's falling, but not if I wanted to put a decorative sheet hanging from the roof. I can do that. I can hang this decorative sheet from the top of the sukkah without a problem. Because decorations don't nullify my schach. Okay, this is very interesting in terms of what's the difference in decorations. If you want to listen to Get That this week, there's a whole discussion about what this issue is about the schach. Why are decorations different from schach? Okay, and how there's a machlok at Rashi Tosfot. As I said yesterday, Gefet is now in English every week as well. So the presentations are in Hebrew, but the video is in English. So you can listen to Gefet, and she talks about the differences in the aesthetics of the sukkah and what's different about decorations than the schach itself, than other parts. So anyway, a worthwhile listen. So now they say the following. If that's the case, so if you're doing it for sukkah decorations, what's interesting, and this is what Rabbanit Shimoni talks about in Gefet, is you've taken it's the exact same thing, it's a sheet. But because you put it there for decorative purposes rather than to collect the leaves, it has a different nature and is viewed as something totally different. That's very interesting in and of itself. Okay, so now the Gemara says, Pshita, isn't that obvious? Why are you telling us? And what Rav Chisda tried to do is, I want to narrow the Mishnah. The Mishnah is only talking about, at least the case where it says, if you put it under, right, when you say you put the sheet underneath, when you put the sheet underneath, the schach, it's only disqualified if you put it there for the purposes of catching leaves, not if you did it for decorative purposes. To which the Gemara says, you're not adding anything. It's exactly what the Mishnah said. Pshita, mipnei nishartnan. It said, because of things that might be falling. So they say, well, ma'u detema hu adinda filu lenauta. Maybe it meant even if you're using it for decoration. But the reason it said nishar was because it wanted to just use the most typical case. It's not the most typical to put it there for decorative purposes. It's more typical to put it there for leaves. So maybe the Mishnah just gave the most normal example, but what didn't mean only that case. Therefore, kamash malan, that's what Rav Chisda said, no, that's not talking about decorative. Let's try to bring a proof from a Braita for Rav Chisda's position. Again, that if you do it for decorative purposes, you put your sheet up, it's not a problem. It doesn't nullify, it doesn't kind of cancel or mess up your schach. The Braita says if you put up schach the way you were supposed to, and then you decorated it with kramim, ustinim amitzuyarim, with all types of sheets or cloth that was decorative, and you hung up nuts and almonds and peaches and pomegranates and all sorts of pretty fruits. Parkilei anavim, okay, I'm not sure what parkilei are, but types of grapes. Okay, somehow something having to do with grapes. Let me just see if I can find what that is. Parkile anavim, right? Bunches. Okay, this is, I used to just have this in my sukkah. They were actually fake, but these clusters of grapes. Va'atzarot shel shibolin. Okay, and we call them crowns made from wheat, from those wheat stalks. Yenot shmanim uslatot, wines and oils and solet. This, by the way, sounds very much like the temple, where you have wine libations and oil libations and the meal offerings, right? The fine flour. Asur at least to pay man. By the way, Rashi also here, it's something that Rabbanit points out, where it says kramim mitzuyalin and stinim mitzuyalin. Rashi says, what are kramim ma'aseh oreg, and the stinim, he says ma'aseh rokem or ma'aseh oreg. It's very much like what? Like in the temple when they had all these, right, in the Mishkan, the tabernacle was made with all these beautiful embroidery work. So it's the same idea here. So now they're going to say, asur listapek mehen. Okay, this is, by the way, similar to what we've been discussing about the comparison between the temple and the tabernacle. In any case, that's an aside. So you can't use any of these things you hung on Motzei Yom Tov Acharon Shel Chag until after the holiday is over. This is a muktzah issue, as we said. V'imitnale, as we said earlier in yesterday's class, v'imitnalehem, but if you put them up with the intent that you'd be using them, hakol afitnal, then it goes according to what you stipulated. So what do you see here? The main point, without getting into all the other details, is that you can hang these sheets. Seems like it's fine. So they say, oh no, this doesn't prove anything. Maybe when it was time to hang sheets, it meant hanging them on the walls. Itmar. Next halacha. If you have decorations in your sukkah, and let's say your sukkah is more than 20 cubits, but you have decorations hanging down, and your airspace then it becomes less than 20 cubits, it doesn't help you at all, because it goes by the height of the schach and not how much airspace there is in the sukkah. But if you're talking about the width and the length, the minimum of 7 by 7 handbreadths, then if you put things on the walls and you close how much space you have to live in, then it doesn't have room for rosho, rubo, and shulchano, your head, the majority of your body, and your table, and therefore it actually is a problem. Now we have Binyamin, the slave of Rav Ashi. Im timisha le ketunta b'maya. He got his cloak all full of water. V'ishtatcha ametalalta. He hung it to dry on his sukkah. Amar le Rav Ashi, Dalia, take it off. I don't want anyone to think that we're using your clothes as schach. But the servant says, but everyone can see it's wet. To which Rav Ashi says, I'm talking though, once it dries, no one's going to know. They're going to think we're putting schach with the sheet. It's a problem with the clothing. Itmar, another machlok. No yesukam uflagim mimena arba'a. If you have decorations from a sukkah that are 4 tvachim away from the ceiling, Rav Nachman Amar Kshera, he says it's not a problem. Rav Chisda Rav Rafuna Amre Psula. Okay, we have this issue here, that the issue, right, that if these are basically blocking, it's almost like it creates another ceiling underneath. So is this a problem? Is it not a problem? Rav Chisda Rav Rafuna said this is a problem. Okay, because they're kind of separated from the schach, and it's as if you have something on top of you. So now we get to a story. The background to the story is that if you remember, Rav Nachman was the rabbi of the Reish Galuta, the exilarch. And he was a big, wealthy figure that often also knew Torah, not always. There were all sorts of banquets that always went on. Rav Chisda often got into issues with them. Wasn't always, buddies with the Reish Galuta, like Rav Nachman, and we're going to see the story now. So Rav Chisda v'Rabbar Rafuna ikla leBeiresh Galuta. They get to the exilarch's house. Igninhu Rav Nachman b'sukkah sheno yam b'flagim mimena ba'arba'at tvachim. He slept them in the place of the sukkah. He gave them their beds to sleep in, right underneath right in the sukkah where there was these decorations that they thought were problematic, and Rav Nachman thought that it was fine. Now, this was clear from the rest of the story that he obviously did this on purpose. He wanted to show them. Maybe you also have a showdown with them, because let's see what happens. What's their reaction? They're silent, and they go to their beds as if there's no problem. Nachman's a little bit pissed off. I think he was hoping for a bit of action here. Did you change your minds? Right? He wanted to say, oh, see, you must change your minds. I'm right. To which Amrule, they said to him, great answer. We're actually exempt from Sukkah because we're on our way to do a mitzvah. What mitzvah were they doing? Rashi says they were going to visit the Reish Galuta. It's like visiting your rabbi. Maybe they're almost saying, right, you want to make a whole big thing and you know we're not really the Reish Galuta's best friends, but here we have respect for him. We're going to visit. It's the mitzvah. Some people say the mitzvah was they were on their way to do some other mitzvah, like redeeming someone in captivity or something else. Okay, and Tosfot even says, Shluchei mitzvah anan, he says, and in a way that why are Shluchei mitzvah ptulim? If they were now to go find another sukkah, they wouldn't end up going to do their mitzvah. It would basically take them time to go find another sukkah, and then they lose their opportunity to do a mitzvah. We're going to get into this whole sukkah later on about why are shluchei mitzvah exempt? Someone on the way to do a mitzvah, why is he exempt from sukkah? Have a whole interesting discussion. We'll get to that in a number of dapim. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Now we have a halacha said by Shmuel in the name of Yehuda. We're going to see later that that there's a different version of this, but right now we're going to say this one. Mutar lishon b'kila b'sukkah. You can sleep underneath a bed canopy, even if it has a roof, which sounds like the canopy bed, right, with 4 beams, it's okay. As long as it's within 10, it's less than 10 tefachim of height, then already it's not considered a tent, right, that will block off your schach from being your schach. So we're going to have a slew of questions against this. Tashma, but it says in the Braita, you're not fulfilling your obligation. So they say, don't worry about that. On that Braita is when the height is 10. Another source, and that's when it's already 10, it'll be a problem. Shmor was talking less than 10. If you sleep under a bed in a sukkah, you're not fulfilling your obligation. That's almost the same thing, under a bed, because you have the bed is kind of your tent, right, the bottom of the bed when you're underneath it. So they say that's not a problem. Originally, I think they assumed the height of a bed is not usually 10 tefachim off the ground. But they say, no, Shmuel already explained that Mishnah as saying it's talking about a height of over 10. So then it fits in with Shmuel. But Tashma, here we're going to have more of a problem. But then it says, if you put it over these 4 beams, it's disqualified. To which they say, no, again, you could say it's because it was higher than 10, and Shmuel said less than 10. But but doesn't it say there that it's talking about less than 10? How so? Titanias, it says in a Braita, this Braita that they're referring to, naklitin shnayim, vikinofot arba'a. Naklitim are 2 beams, right, with the beam going across in the V shape, okay, without a roof, and kinofot are 4. If you did it on the kinofot, it's disqualified. Al gabe naklitin shera. The naklitin is fine. As long as the naklitin are less than 10. Now, that sounds like when the V shape has to be less than 10, but it doesn't say anything about the kinofot, which means that the kinofot psula must be even at a height of less than 10. Michalal the kinofot because it didn't say there anything about 10, so it must be even less than 10. In which case, how can he say that? If he says the kila, right, which is this canopy, and the kinofot, which sounds like it's the same thing. So what are they answer? No, they're actually different. Shani kinofot tikvie. Kinofot are solid. They're there always on the bed. Like I said, I had a bed when I was growing up, a canopy bed. They were always there. The kila is something that you put temporarily over in order to throw something over your bed. That's different. That we're going to say only at a height of 10 is it significant, whereas even though it creates this roof, whereas the canopy bed, which is permanent, is going to be even at a height of less than 10. To which the Gemara says, but wait, a sukkah on top of a sukkah is also something that's more permanent because it's a sukkah actually. And V'amar Shmuel, he said it needs to be a minimum of 10. So also there he requires a minimum of 10, even though it's kavua, it's set. Right now, even though sukkah is dirad arai, but he's calling it keva here because it's more solid. So amrei hatam delimifsal sukkah b'asara. There, when it's coming to disqualify another sukkah, it needs 10. Hacha, right? Sorry, you should say even less than 10 because the kinofot is right permanent, and because of that, it's less than 10. So why does by a sukkah he requires 10? That's because in order to disqualify a sukkah, it's 10. But when it comes to the kinofot, well, we want to say, are you under the tent or are you under the sukkah? A tent is going to be even less than 10 as long as it's something more permanent, right? If it's something temporary, then it's only going to be a 10 to 10. But if it's something permanent, then it's going to be a 10 to even less than 10. Amar Tachlif Farber. Another thing we're going to see in the name of Shmuel, Amar Shmuel, Hayashem b'kila erom. If you're sleeping in this canopy and you have no clothes on, can you say Shema? You're not allowed to say Shema with no clothes on. So what do? Right? If your clothes are under a sheet, then you're allowed to. But here, your clothes are, you have no clothes on, you're not covered. But what do? You put your head outside the canopy. And you could read Kriyat Shema, because basically it's as if your body's under a cover, under the kila, and your head is out of it. So the Gemara says, wait a minute. It says in a different source, you can't take your head out of there and read Kriyat Shema, because your body's not really considered covered. So that's when the kila is more than 10. At that point, it's not like you're under a cover because it's so much space there. It's like, right? And because it's such a big space, it's as if even though your head is outside, it's as if your head is inside. We don't follow your head, we follow where your body is because it's in this big space. Hachinami mistaber, and you can further prove it, mitikatani seif, as it says there at the end of that source, to what is the similar? It's just like it says in the source there in that Braita, that someone who sleeps in a house, the case where you're under the canopy is like someone who sleeps in a house, and it's a problem. If you just stick your head out, we go by where your majority of your body is, because it's like you're in a house. It's only going to be like you're in a house if it's got this 10 tvachim of height. If it's not 10 hambrats high, then you can't compare that to a house. And that's what Shmuel was talking about when he said it's okay. Okay, what we're going to start with tomorrow, we're going to finish up this, and then we're going to see the second version of Shmuel. Going back to this kilat chatani, this kilah, we talked about it, kilat. Later we're going to see maybe it was a kilat chatanim, which is something a little different, and we'll get to that in the next shiur. Have a Shabbat Shalom, have a Shavua Tov, and a good fast, a meaningful one, and may the temple be rebuilt soon. We'll no longer have to, we'll turn Tisha B'Av into a day of celebration. Have a good day.